Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're unpacking the exact mechanics of how one of the world's most prosperous economies was literally dismantled over 2 centuries. We hear a lot about the political side of colonial India, but today we're zooming right in on the economics. We want to answer one massive question. Why did India's economy decline so significantly during this era? So let's just dive right in.
Right off the bat, I want to shatter a really common misconception. Just look at this quote from Victor Alexander Bruce, the Viceroy of British India back in 1894. He basically says India wasn't some struggling nation that needed saving. No, it was an absolute economic powerhouse. It was the undisputed crown jewel of the empire. I mean, losing it literally meant the sun setting on British dominance. So the question is, how do you take the very pivot of an empire and hollow out its economic core?
To answer that, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover 1. India's pre-colonial prosperity, 2. The colonial economic strategy, 3. Agricultural stagnation and exploitation, 4. Deindustrialization and lost jobs, 5. The Great Wealth Drain, and finally 6. The devastating human cost.
All right, starting with part 1, India's pre-colonial prosperity. Take Dakhai muslin, for example. Before colonial rule, India had this incredibly independent, dynamic economy. And sure, agriculture was the main gig, but India was globally famous for high-quality, manufactured luxury goods. The craftsmanship was just unmatched. Dakhai muslin from Bengal was so exceptionally fine that foreign travelers called the best variety Malmal Shahi, which translates to fit for royalty. So India wasn't just growing crops, right? It was a sophisticated manufacturing hub for the entire world.
So the absolutely crucial point here is understanding this devastating flip. This wasn't just some accidental decline, it was a total structural transformation. The colonial government actively forced a change in the trajectory of the entire subcontinent's economy. They literally took a nation famous for exporting premium finished luxury items and forcefully turned it into a mere exporter of raw materials and, on the flip side, a massive importer of finished factory goods.
Which brings us to part 2, the colonial economic strategy. This twofold strategy you're seeing was basically the blueprint for systemic economic decline. The policies pursued, well, they were never about developing the local economy. Instead, step 1 was reducing the country to a supplier of raw materials, things like raw silk, cotton, wool, indigo, all just to feed Great Britain's rapidly expanding industrial base. And step 2? Ensure that once Britain turned those raw materials into finished goods, they had a sprawling, captive market in India to sell them back to. It was essentially a closed loop of exploitation, completely designed for the advantage of the home country.
Okay, part 3. Agricultural stagnation and exploitation.
Now, despite having incredibly fertile lands and this long history of agricultural wealth, the farming sector was purposefully starved of investments. While the colonial government totally relied on Indian agriculture to produce those raw materials we just talked about, they completely ignored the need for basic infrastructure. I mean, there was practically zero investment in terracing, flood control, drainage, or desalination. Technology remained stubbornly low, and the use of fertilizers was pretty much negligible. And that lack of investment, it becomes absolutely catastrophic when you realize that 85% of India's population lived in villages and derived their livelihood directly or indirectly from agriculture. Think about that. When you artificially stagnate a sector that houses 85% of your people, you aren't just slowing down an economy, you are impoverishing an entire continent. So, how exactly did they enforce the stagnation? Well, mainly through land settlement policies, like the infamous zamindari system, which was implemented largely in the Bengal presidency. This was, quite frankly, a perfectly exploitative machine. The profits didn't go to the cultivators actually working the land. They were siphoned off to the zamindars, or landlords, and these landlords were heavily pressured by the colonial government with fixed revenue deposit dates. If a zamindar missed a date, they literally lost their rights. So, this forced a ruthless, relentless collection of rent, completely regardless of the farmer's economic condition. Farmers were left with absolutely zero resources to invest in technology, and worse still, they were forced into commercializing agriculture, meaning they had to shift from growing food to feed their own families to growing cash crops just to feed British industries.
Moving to part 4, deindustrialization and lost jobs. This right here is the tragic human side of that economic policy we just went over. As the colonial government systematically choked off India's world-famous handicraft industries, it created massive overnight unemployment. We're talking highly skilled artisans losing their livelihoods in a flash.
And in a cruel twist of fate, this mass unemployment wiped out local supply, which perfectly paved the way for cheap, factory-made British imports to just flood in and capture the entire market. Now, you might be wondering, didn't modern industries eventually step in and replace those handicrafts? Well, actually, the reality of modern industrialization in colonial India was incredibly bleak. Sure, a few cotton and jute textile mills slowly appeared, and companies like Tata Iron and Steel popped up around 1907, but the colonial government never allowed a true capital goods industry to take root. And without factories that build the machine tools needed to start other factories, real industrialization is virtually impossible. Because of this, the industrial sector's contribution to the GDP stayed minuscule. And the public sector? It was intentionally confined to things like railways, communications, and ports. Basically, infrastructure built solely to efficiently extract raw materials and transport British goods, not to actually serve the Indian public. All right, Part 5, the Great Wealth Drain. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 basically acted as a geographical cheat code for the British Empire. By connecting the Mediterranean Strait to the Red Sea, it drastically reduced the cost and time of transportation between Europe and South Asia. This engineered waterway tightly sealed Britain's monopoly over Indian trade. More than half of all India's foreign trade was rigidly restricted to Britain, ensuring they had first pick of India's resources at the absolute cheapest shipping costs. Now, what's really fascinating, and honestly tragic, is where the export surplus went. Throughout the colonial period, India actually generated a massive export surplus. Now, normally, exporting more than you import means gold and silver are flowing into your country, building up massive national wealth. But that didn't happen for India. That surplus was used as a literal drain. The profits from Indian exports were diverted to pay for British administrative offices back in London, to fund wars fought by the British government all around the globe, and to pay for imported invisible items. The wealth of one nation was systematically siphoned off to build another. Which leads us to Part 6, the devastating human cost. Just pause and let this number sink in for a second. 32 years. During the colonial era, that was the average life expectancy for an Indian citizen. Today, it sits closer to 70 years. This staggering metric is, without a doubt, the most direct reflection of an economy that was designed to extract rather than to sustain. And if you think that's shocking, the infant mortality rate was an alarming 218 per 1,000 live births. Just to put that into perspective, compare it to modern figures of around 28. Because public health facilities were practically non-existent or just completely inadequate for the masses, water and airborne diseases literally ran rampant, taking a terrifying toll on the absolute most vulnerable people. These 2 centuries of structural extraction created extensive, just crushing poverty. Essential commodities like food grains and clothes were scarcely available in the domestic market, mainly because they were all being exported out. A vast section of the population simply did not have basic housing or their most fundamental needs met. And social development? It was entirely neglected. When overall literacy stays below 16% and female literacy is at a negligible, heartbreaking 7%, you're looking at a population that has been completely denied the most basic tools required to improve their lot in life. The colonial system didn't just drain wealth, it drained opportunity. Which really leaves us with this provocative thought as we wrap up today's explainer. When India finally achieved independence in 1947, it wasn't just starting from scratch, it was starting from a massive deficit. We've seen how agriculture was broken, industry was suppressed, wealth was drained, and human capital was devastated. So how long does it actually take for a nation to rebuild an entire economy after 2 centuries of such systemic, calculated wealth drain? It's a monumental, almost unimaginable task. And understanding the sheer depth of this historical decline is absolutely crucial if you want to appreciate the economic journey of modern India. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. Keep questioning the numbers, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.